All right. Well, let's jump back into our discussion here as we talk about the JEDP theory documentary hypothesis. So, who can tell me who it was who's credited with coming up with this again? Name should be right on the tip of your tongue, right? No, that's okay. It's a guy named Wellhausen is the guy that is typically given credit for this in the mid-1800s. And this idea, I mean, you guys may be saying, why are we worrying about this? Why are we talking about this? You know, it's a bunch of old stuff. This idea rules the day even today. If you were to pick up commentaries and look at commentaries and scholarship, it's a given. It's just assumed in so many different commentaries that this is the case. And the whole picture of the documentary hypothesis is said, well, we know, let's just begin with this, we know there couldn't have only been one author. There had to have been more than one author to the Law of Moses, to the 5 books of Moses, because if it was one author, they made a whole lot of mistakes. They have problems. They repeat stories in various places where clearly that story only happened once, but it's being retold by different authors, and somebody took all of the different writings out there and just compiled them together and stitched them up at some point. And when that was, that theory has ranged all over the place. Obviously, nowhere near as old as the time of Moses. In fact, most people who buy into this would say that it was Josiah's day at the earliest, probably after that. They would say probably Deuteronomy would have come from Josiah's day, but otherwise everything else would be later. That's what people tend to believe, because they think that's what the evidence supports. That there's so many differences throughout the writings, places where you can clearly see distinct writing style, vocabulary. And what they do is they've broken it down into these 4 categories. Anybody remember what the J stands for? All right, Jehovah. What does the E stand for? Elohim. What is the D? All right. Deuteronomy or Deuteronomic writer. And then the P? Priestly. So they would say that you can kind of see all of the writings can either fall into one of these categories. There are times in which the God of Israel is called Jehovah or Yahweh. And when that's the case, that means that this writer is the one who is writing in that day and time. The Elohim, I think they believe the Elohim is the oldest one, if I'm not mistaken. In times in which Jehovah is called Elohim, that's clearly another writer in his day and time, and that's the word that they used for God at that time. The Deuteronomic writer, he's the one who's responsible for Deuteronomy, which has its own weird focus, and it's doing its own thing. And then the priestly is the one who is the most focused on all of the priestly duties and garments and festivals and all of those things, a lot of what's going on in Leviticus and other places. But they would say clearly there are at least four clearly defined breaks. And again, this is just understood. It's given by so many scholars, even today, who don't question it, who don't challenge it. So, let me give an answer to this, which is why I brought it up tonight to talk about it, because I do want to respond. First of all, we don't know what we don't know, right? And I think it's important to remember that. They may be looking at a very limited amount of information and saying, hey, here's all of these things based on the limited amount of information that we have. There may be more that's going on that we're just never will be privy to, as far as why you see those distinct differences that take place. So that's making assumptions on not having information, first of all. Let's see here. Just a couple examples of this very idea that we don't know what we don't know. Until about the mid-1940s, people generally believed or assumed that Ecclesiastes was actually written in the 1st century BC. That was the general date given for it. And so in the 0 to 100 BC. Why? What changed in the 1940s? The Dead Sea Scrolls, which have writings that date earlier than 200 BC, and which Ecclesiastes is there, right? With more information comes more knowledge of what's going on, and a lot of people make assumptions about things, and then later on those assumptions are found not to be accurate. Until very recently, many believed that David was to Israel what Arthur is. It's Arthur, right? Arthur. What Arthur is to England. What is Arthur in England? King Arthur, Camelot, Round Table. A legend, a myth. He's a guy that they kind of rally behind, who never actually really existed in the way that they describe it or think about it. And people are like, well, that's Israel's David. Until relatively recently, what have they begun discovering? References to, to the literal David, like stuff during David's time that is mentioning David. And suddenly there are pieces that are corroborating the fact that there was a real person named David who was the king. It's not just some kind of fanciful legend. That doesn't mean that they buy into all of the stories, mind you. Doesn't mean that they assume that there was a Goliath and all the other things. But they can't deny that David as a person existed. So until, let's see, we just need to be careful of arguments that are based on the fact that, well, it must be this way because we don't have any evidence of something else. And that seems to be what a lot of this is. It's assumptions that are made simply because we don't have the evidence telling us how it was put together. All right. Also, I will say there has been a current and recent scholarship, particularly on the conservative side, which is where we would place ourselves, that is completely rejecting this. And instead, what the scholarship is saying is, hey, why couldn't it just be an author who's really good at writing? Instead of it being a bunch of stilted pieces that appear as if they're joined together badly, they made mistakes because look at how many stories have women at wells in them. Look at these stories of going into a city and lying about who your wife is, and all of these things. And they would say, man, what a clumsy person who stitched all of this together. They left all of the double stories in. What if you just have an author who is using a literary technique of repeating narratives in order to bring you along the larger narrative in which these repeating narratives kind of guide the way that you're reading the text? Maybe it's actually really clever writing that puts all of this together the way that it does, and it's not a Frankenstein type of a piece. That's the camp I sit in, by the way. I think it's really, really well done. And there's a huge amount of literary value. And there are pieces that stitch together these two camps. that you have literary pieces that are very much the same in style and picture, and that they flow together, and yet they use the different names. To me, that's a demonstration that this is purposeful. All of this, whatever was done, was purposeful and for a reason, not a demonstration that it's other people. So, all of this to say, if you start really like digging into some of this, or even talking to some people who are familiar with this, and they'll say, well, you know, Moses didn't write the books of the law, right? And you're like, well, yeah, he did. No. They figured that out a long time ago. Haven't you ever heard of JEDPD, or JEDP? Haven't you ever heard of, if they start talking about this type of stuff, a lot of people buy into this. And even on a popular level, you would be surprised how many people believe this that you might even interact with as a way to discredit the Scriptures. And I would say don't allow it. It's not a discredit. In fact, I think what it is that they're trying to combat is actually proof of a really well-written piece that somebody put together. Is that fair? All right. Any questions or comments before we move on out of the Old Testament canon discussion? Yes? Oh, I think you mean as far as the Jewish people themselves would, I think, be with us, that it was clearly written by Moses. Yeah, we're talking, I would say liberal scholars, but it's almost across the board. There's tons of what I consider to be conservative scholars that I respect greatly, who still, when I read their commentary on Genesis, they'll talk about these various pieces. Or they'll say, well, this section right here was, this is the J section or the D section or whatever the case is. And it's just kind of assumed, like I said. But the Jewish people, no, they wouldn't buy into this. Yeah. Oh, yeah. They definitely would be. All right. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, let's then move into looking at the New Testament. And to do so, I just want to reiterate just a few things. We mentioned before inspiration in the Old Testament. What did it look like in the law, generally speaking? Well, but that's the question. What does that look like? God what? Okay, God told them and they wrote it? Him. God told him, he wrote it. What kind of relationship did Moses have with Yahweh? Personal, face-to-face, right? Isn't that what Numbers chapter 12, when Miriam and Aaron came up, and Miriam's like, hey, we're prophets too. And God's like, no, you're not. I mean, you're prophets, but you're not Moses, because him I speak with face-to-face. Not the same with you. So there was something very special about that. And he told Moses to write, and Moses would write, and Moses kept a journal of the various things, is what it appears to be the case. What about the prophets? Let's just focus on the latter prophets, what we call the writing prophets. Right. This is the thus saith the Lord. They would receive what? Visions and dreams, in which they would be told, here is what to do. Here's how you need to do this. Here, go and write this down and take this to this king or to that king or to this people, or do this and tell all of Israel this is what it means, right? So you have this, thus saith the Lord, but then you have the third part, and that is the writings. What about the writings? Is this God coming to them telling them what to write? What do the writings begin with? The Psalms, very first book. Are the Psalms dictated by God? Against you and you only, O Lord, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Is God controlling those words from David's pen? No. And I think it's important that we understand that inspiration is not always just simply God zapping them and causing them to write. In these cases, who is it who decided to pick up the pen? The psalmist himself. When David writes Psalm 51, there's no vision, there's no message. I don't even think there's an urging. I think he just understands this is what I need to do. And he sits down and he writes it. 100%. 100% the writing of man. Does that make sense? Yeah, Dave? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would say he writes because he's a psalmist. That's what he does. He wrote so many psalms, and in this moment, in order to get to where he needs to be, he refers back to what he does, and he writes the psalm. I don't think that we have to envision in some way that David is sitting there and God's like, all right, I think it's time the psalm's written now, and gives him kind of a little smack, and then something goes on in his brain, and he goes, you know what, I should probably write this down. I don't think we need to envision that there is an outward motivation from God to cause him to write, other than the fact that he writes psalms. That's his outlet. That's what he does. That's his creative power. And remember, from the very beginning, there are two narratives that describe who David is. By the way, this also goes to the JEDP, except further, outside of the law itself. Two different narratives are origin narratives for David's story. What are those? Anybody remember? One's the easy one. Everybody remembers. David and Goliath. That's how David comes onto the scene and enters into Saul's court, right? What's the other one? No? Sean said when Samuel goes to Jesse's, that's just his anointing, but that's not his entrance into Saul's court. Yeah. When Saul was having issues, David came in as a musician to calm him down. Those two are at odds, by the way, with one another. There are details in each story that you're like, okay, wait, how can this be the case if this is? Or how could this be the case if this is? And we can spend all our time until we're blue in the face trying to figure out, well, we can reconcile it by doing this or this. I'm not sure the point is to reconcile them. I think the point is to take them each for what they are. Because the Goliath story accentuates David as what? A warrior. The kingly warrior who goes out and conquers. Is that who David is? Absolutely. But what does the other one do for us? Introduces David as what? The creative musician, the psalmist, the one who can pierce into people's hearts and bring them enlightenment that they wouldn't otherwise have had. Is that David? Absolutely. And both pictures, both sides of David, that kind of seem at odds, both of them are right there at the very beginning. I think, Dave, when talking about David, you ask, why write it? I think that's it. It's because it's what he does. That's who he is. Yeah, Cliff? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. That's a horrible P. Hold on a second. Yeah. Let's look. Well, no, we're not going to look, but Psalm 22. How does that begin? How does that begin? Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Does that have any foreknowledge to it in its writing? Jesus brings that up on the cross and says, hey, by the way, everybody who's watching these events, if you want to put them within a literary framework, go read Psalm 22 and you'll understand what's happening here, right? That's incredible. Now, David doesn't write that about Jesus, and I think we understand that, right? David writes that about his own life, his own circumstances, what he's going through. But that is the framework, the literary framework, by which Jesus himself says, go look at Psalm 22 to understand my events. But not just Psalm 22. What else? What other Psalms? What about 110? Psalm 110, how does that one begin? Also quoted by Jesus, if I got it right. You guys are making me second guess myself. Yeah. Yeah. The Lord said to my Lord, right? Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David writes this. Who quotes it? Jesus quotes it talking about whom, in essence? Himself, right? He says, who's that Lord that he was talking about? Was it him? Well, clearly not. And Jesus is taking ownership of that, right? What about, no, not Psalm 8. I mean, we could talk about Psalm 8. Let me do 16. And these will, I think, be sufficient. In the middle of Psalm 16, what really important phrase is given? Verse 10. You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay or see corruption. Who quotes that? Peter? Who else? Another P name. Paul? Yeah, Peter and Paul in the book of Acts. Both of them quote Psalm 16 as a reference to what? The resurrection. Now, all of these were written 100% by a man who I believe 100% took it upon himself to say, I need to write this. And he was inspired because of circumstances, because of what was going on, because of whatever the case was. He says, I need to pick up a pen and get a scroll, or if that's what they did, I'm not sure. But whatever the case is, they, 100% man, they wrote these things that end up what? End up prophetic, which means that they are the product of whom? The product of God. Which is why I fully believe they are 100% the product of man and 100% the product of God. Yeah, Sharon? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. His great faith, the man after God's heart, which led him to have the type of heart, type of mindset, that would do these very things, right? At the same time. Do we know anybody lacking faith who accomplished basically the same thing? What did he say? Yep. Yeah. Remember the high priest stood up after the events in Lazarus, with the resurrection of Lazarus there in John. They all got together, and this is the moment that they come together and say, we need to get rid of this Jesus guy. And he says, it is better, I'm pretty sure it's Caiaphas, said, it would be better for one man to die than for the whole nation to go into ruin, right? And then John tells us, I think it's kind of a little snide remark. He says, he had no idea how right he was. He had no idea. What he said was so spot on. And it was so true. And it was absolutely the product of God doing this, wasn't it? How could he say something so true? It was necessary for Jesus to go into death. The one man would die so that the whole nation could be saved. That only works if a man in his circumstances did or said what he believed he should say, and then God was also behind it. That, I believe, is inspiration. Inspiration doesn't always have to be, thus saith the Lord, doesn't always have to be a dream or a vision, doesn't always have to be coming to someone and saying, write this down. In some way, in perhaps the craziest way of understanding inspiration, inspiration can be 100% man simply writing what he feels needs to be written. And what he writes is 100% 100% the product of God. And that's about the best I could tell you. How is that the case? There's a really important word I think that we need to remember. I think it's a mystery. For those of us who always want to know, we always want to wrap our head around it. We always want to have that answer. Where we're just like, yeah, but how? Yeah, but how? But how? But how? Right? It's like the 3-year-old with the why question. Why? We're like, how? Tell us, how does this happen? I don't think we're meant to know all of the intricacies of what inspiration is, except to trust and have faith that when man in certain times sat down to write what needed to be written, they did so 100% by the power of God. It was their words. And I bring all of this up because when we get into the New Testament, I think what we're going to find is that this, by and large, is the way that inspiration works in the New Testament. It is not the face-to-face, write this down with Moses. It is not the dreams and the visions, the thus saith the Lord of the prophets, with one notable exception. What might that be? All right, the revelation of John, which even then, totally just a theory, but what if John is just simply using the prophets and using the language and the pictures and the visions of the prophets and making his writing for them? In some way, there's a lot of that going on. Or it could be very much I shouldn't say modern day, but a prophet like the prophets of the latter prophets, in which they have dreams and visions that are given. Understanding this, Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 1 and 2, I think, are critical. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. As the Hebrews author, and if you were in the class that I did, does anybody remember what I think that Hebrews actually was? Yeah, very good. Who said that? Exactly right, Josie. Yep. That Hebrews is actually a sermon that was dictated and written down. So, Hebrews chapter 1, it begins this way. Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. Have we discussed the different times? Right? You have Moses there at the beginning. You have the former prophets kind of bridging the gap to the latter prophets. Then you have the latter prophets in which God spoke to them. Did he speak to them in different ways? Yeah, sometimes face-to-face, sometimes dreams and visions, sometimes this, right? As the case might be. However, in verse 2, in these days, in these last days, and by the way, we're still in those last days, right? You guys understand what he's saying? If we're comparing one side of the cross to the other side of the cross, we're in the last days right now. In these last days, he's spoken to us by his what? By his Son. So, there is now a difference in inspiration from the old ways to the new way, and that is that things now focus on the Son. So if that is the case, because before it was through prophets many times, many ways, does that mean there are no prophets anymore in the Hebrews author's time? What do you think? There are no, you mean, no, it doesn't mean that. Okay, yes. All right, what would make us think there were prophets in that day and time? Okay, Agabus is a prophet, the apostles, right? Ephesians 4:11, what are the gifts that the Spirit has given to the church? He gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the building up, right? So, it seems as if there are prophets. Maybe it's not spanning the course of 1,000 years, like perhaps the Old Testament. But isn't there a period of, 50 years or so, from maybe the earliest writings in the 40s to the latest writings in the 90s? It's not 1,000 years, but isn't that a chunk of time at least? For some of y'all, listen, 50 years sound like at least a little bit of time, right? I think for most of us that would be the case. What about visions? Don't they have visions in the New Testament? Yeah. How did Paul know how to go to, that he was supposed to go to Troas? There was a vision. What did he see on his way to Damascus? The Lord appeared to him, right? In a way that he didn't appear to the others who were with him, right? Something very specific to him. Didn't he also say in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in order to keep him humble, he was allowed a vision of the third heaven, taken into the third heaven, given that vision? What about Revelation? We talked about that. Aren't these all visions? What's the Hebrews author saying here? I thought I'd see some people trying to flip back in notes from our Hebrews class and be like, did he answer this question way back then? I don't know. Those were a couple books ago for some of y'all, though. Yeah, Kevin? Okay. So that the things that were given pointedly more clearly in the Son himself, directed in that direction. Okay? All right, very good. Yeah, Dale? Okay. All right, so Dale says all authority has been given to Jesus in heaven, on earth, under the earth. Therefore, anything that is now prophetic is from him, from his absolute authority. All right? Let me ask this. I keep looking because I don't know why I think I still have the Old Testament stuff on the board. It's long gone, probably for a few weeks now. All of that Old Testament discussion in various times and in various ways, what was it leading up to? It was all pointing forward to the answer that was coming, right? And did it all sound exactly the same? Like, is Moses writing the exact same as you'll get from Ezekiel, which is the exact same that you'll get from Ezra, Nehemiah? Yeah, Kevin? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. I love this phrase, unfolding the mystery of God. And that all of those pieces, and it is, I really like that, the unfolding aspect, because as you have something compact and you unfold the pieces, the larger picture takes shape, right? If you unfold the map, it's not until all of the unfolding is done before you see the whole picture. And that's kind of what's going on. You have very early Moses stuff. Genesis, they don't even have any idea of what's to come. And it's kind of clear. And yet, so much stuff in Genesis finds itself scattered throughout the rest of the Bible, doesn't it? Even having just huge impacts later on. So, yeah, the unfolding of the mystery. Yeah, Serena? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that next week. Although not necessarily the piecing a larger picture together necessarily, but the fact that they each have their own thing that they're writing. Right. Like I said, we'll talk about that next week, and we'll get into that. But I want to make sure that we understand this is what's happening in various times and in various ways throughout the Old Testament. The picture is unfolding until it is finished and Jesus is on the scene. And at that point, it's done. Now, is there a future hope that we have? Yeah, it's rested in the return of Jesus, that he will come again. But is there future revelation that we're waiting for? Is there future hope that we're like, we need some more information for us to have this hope or this understanding or whatever the case is? No, we have everything right now that is necessary for us to have. You know, Peter, someone brought up Peter earlier. Peter talks about how there were pieces given to the prophets, and they were talking about things they didn't even know they were talking about. Even the angels looked at it, and they were like, what is going on? Even the angels long to understand, and we are in the place of knowing. We have it. It's been handed to us, and we don't have prophets that are coming to us saying, hey, just wait, because the next big thing is coming. The next Savior is coming. The next answer to your problems. The next hope that you have. No. We have all the information right now. We no longer need prophets in various means and in various ways. We have the Son. And like Kevin said just a second ago, everything that we have now, does it point to the Son? The New Testament, it points to the Son and how to live life in his church, right? So there's no new revelation that's necessary. There's no new hope. There's no new Messiah. There's no new anything else. The Hebrews writer is saying, we have arrived. And remember, his whole point is, don't go back into the unknown, right? Don't give up this hope for a hope that was nestled in a we don't know what we want because it hasn't been revealed yet. He says here, we have arrived. We have the Son, and all of our hope is built around it. And so as we look at inspiration within the New Testament, what we're going to find is inspiration that is founded in the idea that Jesus has come. And now we're trying to figure out what does that mean for us. We're out of time. What I'm going to suggest next week is that this picture right here is exactly the picture that we need to understand when we look to how inspiration works in the New Testament. And to do so, we're going to talk about the Gospels. We're going to talk about the letters. And we're going to talk about how they came to writing stuff down and how that inspiration for them works. All right. Everybody good? All right. Good class, guys.